Is it?
Wow. Uh,
Looks like it was recording.
okay. Sounds good. Yes, I saw a recording here as well. Um, so welcome everyone to our November webinar for SOA. Um, we have two very special guests here today in collaborations with the SOA. We have André is a qualified actuaries and a charter investment manager with 30 years of experience as a trusted advisor to pension plans in governance, fundings, investing, sustainable factor integrations, and management of climate-related risk and opportunities. He just obtained the new CFA Institute of Climate Risk Evaluations and Investing certificate in a cohort of programs. So if you have any questions about that, can ask later on. Um, he also held a plethora of roles at many different firms. Is deeply passionate about implementing climate change strategies and was awarded the CIA President's Award in 2022 for his groundbreaking work as chair of the Climate Change and Sustainability Committees. And we have our second guest speaker here. Harry is a seasoned actuary with a strong background in insurance and consulting. He has extensive experience and knowledge of the US and international accounting standards and led large-scale accounting implementations efforts and passionate about climate risk. Harry is also a member of the CIA Climate Change and Sustainable Committees and part of the task force behind developing of the CIA statements, integrating nature in climate scenarios analysis for enhanced resilience. So we have a very good experienced speaker in here, and I will turn the floor to Andrew and Harris to share their presentations and start.
Thank you for this introduction. Yes, so Ari and I welcome everybody to this seminar, and it's a pleasure for us to be at ASNA. So Ari and I will talk to you about climate change, and in particular how actuaries are responding to it, whether they work on the assets or on the liability side of the equation. Um, in this short talk, 45 minutes, we will try to build conviction also about why climate change is a serious threat to our financial system and even to the existence of us as a human species. We'll start with the science behind climate change because it is quite hard to predict, and we'll explain why. And then we'll go into why climate change risk is financial risk. And also, we'll go through some global agreements and regulatory regulations that impact our work as actuaries. And finally, Harry and I will each have a case study to present to you to explain, in a concrete example, how actuaries can apply their skills to quantify and identify climate risk. So let's start with a little survey question. In the seminal January 2025 Planetary Solvency White Paper from our friends at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries in the UK, um, what is the expected global GDP destruction in the 3 degrees Celsius of warming scenario by 2050? What kind of impact on global GDP have they um, postulated as part of their research? So is it 70% global disruption of the GDP, or 60%, 50%, 25%, or 2%? Just take a guess if you don't know exactly the answer, or maybe you have a feeling for it. I can't see the results, but
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'll have to unpause to see it, but I do see people are start voting
okay.
on the options. So I'll give it, let's say 15 more seconds for them to kick in. I have nine, I have 10 result now. So for the other four people, I guess are the speaker than us. And I will end the poll here to show the results in here. You're able to see.
Okay, so 60% more. Yeah, most people mention 60%. Actually, the paper basically talks about, oops, the paper quotes 50% of GDP losses in the extreme scenarios, but also at 3 degrees Celsius of warming, there will be other severe impact on human mortality, breakdown of ecosystem, and socio-political upheavals due to state failures. and the whole insurance sector would be drastically different. So I recommend you read this paper. There's a link at the bottom of the slide that I think the slides will be distributed later. So you can basically review how actuaries have worked with climate scientists and systems experts in order to basically give a picture of what global warming might look like. So the first step in understanding the impact of climate change on pension plans or insurance companies is to appreciate, I would say, even have reverence for the science behind climate change. So that's what we'll cover first. Um, so let's start at the beginning. When solar energy hits our planet, that's the yellow arrow, 70% of the energy is absorbed by our atmosphere, our oceans, or our land surface. And the remaining 30% is reflected back into space. As the Earth absorbs solar radiation, it warms up and it emits energy in the form of long wave infrared radiation. That's the red arrow there on the picture. So for the last 10,000 years, there was a delicate balance between the incoming solar radiation, reflected solar radiation, and outgoing thermal energy, which has allowed the human race to exist in a relatively welcoming climate. But the problem is that due to the rising level of greenhouse gases, and the main culprit being carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, much of the thermal energy has not escaped into the atmosphere. It has warmed the planet. So you might say, well, are there other causes of climate change than human? Yes, there are natural causes, as you can see on the left, but a lot of them occur over a very long period of time, except for volcanoes, which when they erupt, they release aerosols, which are tiny particles or droplets into the atmosphere, and that may reduce the incoming solar radiation and cool the planet. But climate scientists are almost unanimous to agree that the impact of human causes since the Industrial Revolution has been the driving force in global warming. And not just the burning of fossil fuel, but which releases greenhouse gas emissions, but also the alterations in the Earth's surface due to urbanization, agriculture, deforestation, which can change the reflectivity of the Earth's surface, leading to localized warming or cooling. So you might wonder, well, okay, well, what makes climate change so difficult to predict? We just need to track, greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. Well, it's not that easy because things get complicated because of climate feedback mechanism and tipping points. Climate feedback mechanisms, well, they could be negative or positive. The negative feedback mechanisms are those which slow down global warming. So, for example, cloud feedback. Low-level clouds can reflect sunlight back into space, which has a cooling effect on the planet. So, as global warming changes, the level of clouds increases and changes as well. Another important feedback, negative feedback, is chemical weathering, which is a process that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it in the earth, acting as a natural carbon sink. Now, in terms of positive feedback, which speed up global warming, we have ice reflectivity feedback. So that's when the ice and snow melt due to the warming temperatures. They expose darker surfaces like water or land. These darker surfaces absorb more sunlight, leading to further warming and more melting. So it kind of like it is like a rolling stone that increases global warming sometimes faster than we had originally thought. And next, you have water vapor feedback. So warmer temperatures increase the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere, which is a potent greenhouse gas as well. And finally, you have complex feedbacks, which are basically permafrost thawing. So when permafrost thaws, it releases stored carbon and methane in the atmosphere, which creates greenhouse gases, but it opens up areas for trees and carbon sink to happen. And lastly, ocean circulation. So changes in temperature and salinity of the ocean can affect ocean currents, which play a critical role in distributing heat around the planet. So the main takeaway here is that although we may understand how these feedbacks occur, we have difficulty predicting how fast they will occur. And that's why scientists are sounding the alarm that, downplaying the impact of warming climate can be dangerous. Actually, going beyond 1.5 degree or even 2 degrees Celsius is dangerous because we may hit climate tipping points. And what are tipping points? Well, tipping points are points of no return in the evolution of global warming. The most important tipping points that are at risk of being breached are those yellow dots here, yellow circles. So they are dangers of being breached if we reach beyond 2 degrees Celsius of warming. For example, the Labrador Sea subpolar gyre, which is a current in North Atlantic Sea, which circulates warm water. So if this is changes, it can affect the weather and the cooling of the weather in the UK and Europe. West Antarctic green ice sheets, of course, when they melt, they raise sea levels and affecting currents and coastal areas of island nations. Australia coral reefs eliminating a major part of our biodiversity, and the abrupt warming of permafrost in Canada. So this is a very brief climate science overview of why predicting climate change is so complex. Let's turn our head now on why climate change impacts asset owner and insurers at a financial level. So the financial risk, why climate change is a financial risk. So in July 2024, MSCI, the major index provider, asked 350 industry professionals representing asset owners, managers, banks, and insurers whether asset prices currently reflect climate risk. And you know what it said? Here's the result. So only 7% of industry professionals said that yes, asset prices do capture climate risk, fully capture climate risk. 48% believe that climate risks are not reflected in asset prices, and 41% believe that such risks are partially priced. So this means that the majority of these professionals believe there will be a correction of asset prices as the impact of climate change on portfolio companies become real over time. Now, let's look at the nature of climate risk. So we start with physical risks. Physical risks are not only the damage caused to plants and physical buildings of a company due to extreme weather events like hurricanes, flood, or wildfires. In the future, they will also include chronic risks like extreme heat affecting the productivity of companies, or acute risks, indirect losses in the form of business interruptions, supply chain disruptions, legal liabilities, and of course, the systemic risks that ripple through our financial institutions. This graph shows it's from the Insurance Bureau of Canada and shows an upward trend in annual insured claims. You can see that the average annual claims between 2001 and 2010 were 701 million per year. During the 13 years after 2010, we have seen annual claims exceeding that average of 701 million in 12 of those years. And 2024 was the worst year with claims 11 times the average. The same have been seen around the world in the US with wildfires and hurricanes, or China with floods. Now let's look at the other category of climate risk, which is transition risk. So transitioning to a lower carbon economy carries financial risk linked to factors such as government policy shifts, technological advancements, changing consumer preferences, and market demand, leading to uncertainty in the bottom line of companies. While urgent action is necessary to transition to net zero, it could also cause a risk to financial stability and the broader economy. But a well-managed transition allows the market to anticipate a shift to a climate-resilient future. That's why governments, through the Paris Accord, have released decarbonization plans, which often include a planned phase out of fossil fuels using emission trading systems or carbon taxes. The chart here shows that there's no single price of carbon around the world. Where it would be nice to have a global price of carbon to drive us towards net zero. But at the moment, for example, in Indonesia, a carbon price is 46 cents versus Uruguay, the highest, which is $167 per ton of CO2 equivalent. Canada is at the lower end of the range with the price of carbon currently at about $50, expected to increase by $15 per year to $170 by 2030, although this is up for debate or up in the air now because of the Carney government, which has canceled the carbon tax for individuals. But European countries tend to be at the upper end of the range in terms of their carbon tax. And it's the gradual increase in the price of carbon that will entice markets and consumers to leave old ways behind and adopt renewable energy. Why is a carbon tax important? Well, because the rise of the price of carbon will contribute to assets stranding in the fossil fuel sector due to unburnable carbon. So carbon that cannot be really taken out of the earth at one point. So this increases the credit risks of companies in the sector, in the oil sector, as well as financial institutions who lend to these companies. So in other words, there's a risk for asset owners to be stuck with stranded or illiquid assets. Let me give the floor, I've talked enough now. Let me give the floor to Harry to talk about how climate change impacts life and health insurance companies.
All right, thanks, Andre. I think as Andre mentioned in the previous slides, if you recall the big graph with a significant losses that the Canadian has been suffering from the physical risk of the climate change, and those are really when you think about the loss or more from a property casualty standpoint. I am a life actuary, so certainly I would certainly wanted to also discuss a little bit more about climate change, how that impacts uh, uh, our lives as well as our health, but also the life and health industry. So in this graph, in this slide, we have essentially a few areas that I call out that where climate change could have an impact on life and health. So the first one is respiratory illness. So as we know that climate change could increase the likelihood of wildfires, and as a result of that, they can certainly have the additional air pollution as a result of it, and that can certainly cause the respiratory diseases such as lung cancer for the people that are living in or nearby those areas affected. Malnutrition is another area where climate change could have an impact or long-term impact. Um, and that is again due to the climate change, the negative impact to the security and the level of nutrition from the crop yields, which could impact the long-term food security for the population that impacted in the impacted area. Vector-borne diseases is another interesting one, where climate change could certainly impact certain areas where through increased frequency of floods could certainly change the dynamic of the local uh, ecosystem, which could increase the spread of or spread and transmission of certain vector-borne diseases. Mental health is an interesting one. I'd say it's also one that is maybe a little bit underappreciated. Certainly, following those climate disasters, mental health could increases as a phenomenon known as the common reaction to abnormal events, where people are feel more stressed about the situation that they were in, and that could actually decrease the productivity in the workplace. And then there's a few other ones that I'm not going to go into details due to time constraints. But again, also I wanted to call out one additional areas that I have heard more and more recently was as you may have heard about this artificial intelligence, all those additional data centers that have been built by the companies. And part of the side effect of that is that certain those data centers requires a lot of additional electricity energies, and sometimes those energies are not available in the grid. So then those data centers would actually have their own electricity generators, and some of the generators are powered by gasoline, which as you can guess, they will create a lot of global warming CO2s, and as well as these harmful pollutions into the air, which again have a long-term effect on people's health. So again, those are the few things that are areas where climate change has potential impact to people's health and life. And because of that, it is as an insurer, as a life and health insurer, they must really take that into consideration into their models. Think about how they should manage their business from an ERM standpoint, considering the climate related risks, and also be prepared for some additional regulatory compliance requirement that coming there, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a few slides.
Great. Thank you, Harry. So we've talked a lot about risk up to now, and as the SOA model says, risk is opportunity. So let's look at a bit at opportunities linked to climate change. On this chart from the International Energy Agency, we see on the right-hand side that investment in clean energy technologies and infrastructure is set to exceed $2 trillion in 2024, double the amount in fossil fuel investments, which is the orange bar over here. We've seen notable trends towards investments in clean energy because of government policy frameworks, or cost pressures, and investments aligned with climate solutions. And one of the main area of growth is solar technology. So this graph shows global annual investment in solar technology to produce electricity versus other generation technologies like coal, oil, natural gas, wind, hydro, and nuclear. So it is projected to exceed $500 billion in 2024, surpassing all other generation sources combined. Now, this is not all equally distributed around the world. Definitely, China is leading the pack in terms of new clean energy investments. Although we've seen some progress in India, Brazil, parts of Southeast Asia, and Africa, reflecting new policy initiatives and well-managed public tenders and improved grid infrastructure. So two things to retain from this section are the following. Climate risks are financial risks because they don't just impact physical assets of companies, but they also impact future net income as we gradually move to a net zero economy. And whether you're an actuary working on the asset side or the liability side, you will need to understand how climate-related risks have been integrated in the evaluation of these. Now, let's look at the global agreement and regulatory framework for a second. There's a lot of global agreements, but the main one is, of course, the Paris Agreement, which is a binding agreement signed in 2016 by almost 200 countries, almost all the countries on the planet, to commit to ambitious and transparent plans to set and implement emission reduction actions to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming since industrial age, or no greater than 2 degrees Celsius. And there are three key elements of the Paris Agreement, and they've been, basically focused on the recent COP meetings. So COP28 in 2023, the focus was on global stock take. It means the assessment of whether the world is on track to reach peak GHG emissions. Last year was, the focus was on financing. I mean, the Paris Agreement recognizes that specific needs of developing countries to fund and meet climate transition goals. So there were agreements for funding of those goals from developed countries to underdeveloped countries. And this year in Brazil, right now, the focus is on nationally determined contributions. These are the emission reduction targets of each participating country in the Paris Agreement and the action plan to achieve those targets. And every 5 years, they need to be reviewed, and they need to be more progressive than the previous ones, based on, of course, on the global stock take results. So it's all a series of events that happen from one year to the other. And so far, the Paris Agreement has had an impact. Basically, the reduction in temperature has been better with the Paris Agreement than without. And this indirectly impacts asset owners and insurers through policies and regulations. In Canada, two main regulators. Oopsie, sorry. I'm missing a slide, it looks like. Anyway, in Canada, there's two main regulators. OSFI is the regulator for bank, insurance companies, and pension plans that are federally regulated. And they came up with a guideline called B15 2023, which is the expectation for these financial institutions in terms of reporting and managing climate-related risks. So there's requirements to submit, climate risk reports for fiscal year ending 2024 for the largest Canadian banks and insurers. Nothing yet for federally regulated banks, but apparently it is in the works. For CAPSA, CAPSA is an association of provincial pension regulators, and they came up with a guideline last September, stating that the onus is on the pension plan administrator to consider whether or not or how climate-related risks are material to assessing the financial risk return profile of their fund, and they must take appropriate action. And also, they cannot just delegate these responsibilities to their asset manager or their outsourced chief investment officers. They need to, integrate, this information into the governance, risk management, and investment decision making of their asset manager. So let me let Harry talk about in the U.S. What's the response from the U.S. regulators?
Yeah, from south of the border, there's definitely also a lot of regulatory attention to climate-related risks. For first is the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, so NAIC. You can think of it as the American version of the OSFI. It's a regulator for the insurance companies in general in the U.S. They have taken significant steps to address climate-related risks within the insurance sector. Since 2010, their climate risk disclosure survey has been really a central tool in this effort. So through this survey, basically the insurance companies are asked to disclose several critical aspects related to climate-related risk management. The first is insurers must outline their governance around climate-related risk and opportunities. And this means describing the oversight of their boards as well as senior management on how they manage the climate-related risk, how they tackle the climate issues, and what type of structures that are in place to ensure the accountability of such oversight. Secondly, the insurance companies are required to disclose the impact of climate risk on their business strategy as well as the financial plans. And this pushes the company to really
skate 100 kilometers.
So this, as I was saying, the requirement for companies to disclose those climate-related risk and the impact is again pushes the company to really assess and communicate how climate change would affect their long-term viability of the business model in face of the climate change. Thirdly, is the NAIC also asks for information on how climate-related risk management is integrated into enterprise risk management, or ERM. So as I mentioned earlier, so ERM is a function that's generally performed on a corporate level, and it is important that the company incorporate climate-related risk into this overall risk management framework, so that it demonstrates that climate risk is not managed in isolation, but rather in a broader risk framework of the company. Last but not least is as part of the risk survey, the insurance companies must disclose the metrics and targets that they use to measure and manage their climate risk. So again, the inclusion of this is really also help the regulators, the NAICs, to really benchmark essentially the best practice among the industry, but also help them to understand the climate risk impact to the industry as a whole. Now let's also turn to SEC, so that's the Security Exchange Commission. So SEC's climate disclosure rules that was in place had been really a key topic of discussion for the U.S. public companies, and the goal was to establish a standardized climate disclosure requirement, including disclosing material risks, governance oversight, and also certain greenhouse gas emission targets. And so this disclosure item is really help to align the U.S. companies with the global standards as well as investor expectations. However, in early 2025, due to various reasons, the SDC has paused this federal level effort due to various reasons that it's out of the scope of this presentation. But despite this setback, though, it's still important to note that many U.S. companies continue to prepare those climate disclosures, and again, that is for them to align with their global peers as well as to satisfy their investors' requirements. So all that to say is, as Andre said, both from Canada and also from the United States, climate-related risk is also a key focus when it comes to the regulatory space.
Great. Thank Harry. So now we would like to present two case studies. So the first one is related to climate scenario analysis for an asset owner. So I am an actuary who basically one of my passion and specialty is to develop climate strategies for asset owners, meaning pension plans, foundations, endowments, and family offices. And a climate strategy is basically three steps, but the first step is really to understand, the risks that an asset owner is facing through its portfolio. So it's really looking at from an asset perspective. Um, I mean, actuaries have been doing scenario analysis and stress testings for decades. I mean, it's not new to us. So that's why this is an area where we can definitely be involved. Except that we've done this in the past for financial risk, inflation, interest rates, markets. But now it's kind of new to do climate scenario analysis. Um, this um, like I said, climate scenario analysis allows an asset owner to study the impact of various climate scenarios on key economic and financial metrics. The difficulty is to translate climate scenarios, which are typically come from data accumulated at the UN, United Nations level, an organization called ICPP, made up of a lot of climate scientists, but they usually have data that reflect the impact of climate on Earth metrics, like level of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere or warming of the planet. What we need as actuaries is more impact on GDP, inflation, asset class return, things that can translate into decision-making, items for our clients. So this firm called Ortec Finance is a risk management firm and quite a leader in that space. So they have developed five scenarios. The net zero scenario on the top left is characterized by a rapid government policy, so policies to increase, use of renewable energies, new technologies, and market uptake to drive the global economy towards net zero. On the top right is the high warming scenario, which basically is a scenario where there's no new government policies to reduce emissions in the atmosphere in the future, and physical risks are quite the norm in the future as a result. So we can see on the left graph at the bottom, global emissions have increased since COVID blip in 2020 over here, and it has increased. This is the level of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And under the various scenarios, we can see how things develop. In the most optimistic scenario, which is the green one, greenhouse gas emissions are expected to reach zero by 2055. On the red one at the top, it shows how in the high warming scenarios, global emissions seems to remain constant until 2050. And we were thinking they would increase even more, but this is a result of efforts made so far, like I mentioned earlier, about bringing renewable energy into the market and adopting clean technologies like electric vehicles. On the right-hand graph, you can see this shows the global temperature over time, and you can see it's interesting to see that none of the scenarios by Ortec Finance lead to 1.5 degrees by 2050. So they all overshoot 1.5 degrees, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement to stay below 1.5 degrees. Actually, the expectation at the moment is that we're going to reach maybe 2.6 or 3 degrees Celsius by 2050. And on this slide here, this shows more of the impact of scenarios the impact of various scenarios on on global equity returns, so the returns of global stocks over time. And so the high warming scenario, which is the red line, shows the stepwise downward correction over time in global equity due to recognition of the major near-term shocks that I mentioned earlier, like the climate tipping points as temperature increases, financial market corrections due to the sudden recognition of stranded assets, the pullback of insurance coverage in some geographies, like we've started seeing in Los Angeles and Florida, for example, or sudden step-up policies by governments following a few high impact catastrophes. So looking at this graph, it seems obvious that the desired future for people and for their children are likely to be, the net zero scenario, the green scenario here. So like global equity returns are not as drastically impacted by a high warming scenario. And some pension plans are adopting net zero promise or like engagements, like University Pension Plan in Ontario is one example, or the Quebec Caisse de dépôt as well. So Harry will now discuss stress testing and mortality risk for insurance companies.
All right, thanks, Andre. So when Andre and I were discussing about, what type of case studies we should include, as someone who's working in the life space, stress testing is definitely something that's more relevant when it comes to climate-related risks. So I think for the next 3 slides, what I will do is I'm going to walk you through the process of the stress testing in general, but also how you will incorporate climate risk into that stress testing process. Again, I'm not going to the details in terms of numeric examples, but rather I wanted to lay out the framework, and also more importantly is to walk you through the process of how you perform that stress testing, particularly integrating climate risk into it. So before even going into details, so just maybe a quick introduction to people that are not quite familiar with what stress testing is. So stress testing is a very useful exercise that the companies undertake to not only assess or for their own understanding of their business, but also very much often a regulatory requirement. So usually when companies perform a stress testing, they look at a few things as a result. They're looking at their solvency position, they're looking at their capital position to make sure that whatever they're stressing and whatever the impact is, they try to understand how that impact gonna flow through into their solvency position and the capital position. So as we talked about the climate change, they certainly have a lot of impact in terms of the losses incurred, in terms of the frequency of those events can change, and all that introduces those new risks to the insurers. And Andre and I talked about how that impacts your assets, how conceptually that's going to impact the life and health. So in the life space, traditionally, we're focusing on risks like mortality, longevity, but also investment on the asset side. So climate change certainly impacts all of those. So in terms of actually when you're structuring your stress testing, you certainly wanted to make sure you first pick a driver or a underlying factor from the climate related risk, and then you bridge that into how that financial impact to your company. So maybe we could go to the next slide. Okay, so for this case study, let's specifically talk about excessive heat. As we know, climate change can also have impact in terms of flooding or in terms of other acute events that can have a financial impact to the company. For this particular one, let's focus on excess heat. Again, companies could also choose to integrate multiple drivers in their stress testing, but obviously the more you integrate, the more complex that the model will become. So for excessive heat, So this slide, so I think that the key takeaway from this slide is to show that excessive heat has an impact to the underlying mortality. So rising temperatures certainly driving the heat-related mortalities, especially amongst the vulnerable populations, such as the elderly and those with chronic illnesses, and also certain urban areas where they're prone to those prolonged periods with high heat, due to either geographic reasons or there are certain other reasons that might have an impact to their sort of the heat exposure. So the people or the population in those urban areas can also amplify their heat exposure, cause regional spikes in mortality that might not be captured in a historical baseline. So the graph in this slide really shows the annual rates for death classified as heat related by medical professions. Again, this one is only related to in the United States, so the 50 states plus the DC area. So the orange line that you see here are really the deaths for which the heat was listed as the main underlying cause. The blue line that you're seeing here shows the deaths for which heat was listed as either a underlying or contributing cause of death, and that is from May to September. So based on this graph, you can clearly tell that there is an elevation in the graph, which essentially shows that there's the excessive heat actually have definitely a visible impact to the mortality of the underlying population. So as an actuary, right, like when you look at those data, you really wanted to make sure that you understand that when it comes to climate, historical information may not be an accurate prediction for the future. Okay, so I think those are, so this slide really shows that. And if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so once we talk about, okay, so excessive heat mortality has certainly a linkage. Now let's construct this stress testing model. So first, we need to develop a scenario narrative. So that's essentially the excessive heat as an example. So we start looking at what is excessive heat going to have an impact, not only on the company, which is called a direct impact, but also to the macroeconomy, which all the companies are operating within. So that's what we call it indirect impact. So for direct impact, you can think as a life insurance company, you would have an impact to your underlying insured population, right? Like you wanted to assess what the type of exposures of your underlying insured population has to those excessive heat. So maybe you want to look at the maps of the underlying insured, where they live, and how the location what's the exposure to those excessive heat. And then also you wanted to look at, from the excessive heat event, what is the frequency and severity of that. On the other side, looking at the macro economy, right, you wanted to also assess the excessive heat, what's the impact to the general GDP. Say if you have prolonged excessive heat, it may disrupt certain services, productions, which may have adverse impact on the overall GDPs, but also may have also an impact on the underlying employment level as well. So all those are, you want to think about that, understand the impact, and then ultimately those are going to become an input to your risk models. So then once we understand some of the inputs, some of the exposures that we have, the company has to the excessive heat, then you wanted to bring that into a risk model. And as we talked about, from a life insurance standpoint, there's a few risk areas that we wanted to focusing on: the mortality risk, the longevity risk, as well as the investment risk. So then each of them, you will have a risk model where where you're taking those inputs that we talked about, the exposure to the population, but as well as some of the macroeconomy economic assumptions, like your discount rate, like your investment return, to bring that into your model. And then you essentially use the model to project what are um, your future profits of the company, the business, they're going to look like, and what type of expenses or the claims that you need to be paying, and all that's going to essentially, you calculate that, and then you bring that into your essentially the balance sheet, and then start constructing, what's your reserve going to look like in the event of excessive heat, what type of impact to your reserve. If it's a lot of impact to your underlying insured, they might increase the claim payouts, which increase your reserve, and then that will also decrease your surplus. And then how that going to impact on the capital standpoint, whether you still continue to have adequate capital, or would your capital become deteriorated, and all those are going to be a very useful information for the management of the company to know, so that they will be able to either take actions or to decide what type of mitigations are make sense for the company in order to mitigate those risks in the future. So those are essentially the overall process of stress testing, and how you would incorporate climate-related risk into a life insurance context.
Great, thank you, Harry. So this we come to the end of the formal part of the presentation. I think we'll open up the floor now to questions.
Yeah, so to the audience here, feel free to unmute yourself or type your questions on the chat. We'll leave a few seconds for everyone to get your questioning. But if not, I do have some burning questions that I want to ask. So I'll start with that while we wait for participants to get their question ready. So my first question is, this climate risk is still pretty new topic. What are some of the skills you think are important to for actuaries to work in the space, and what kind of skill development they should focus on?
So yeah, I can start, and maybe, and Harry, you can certainly add in. I think on the technical side, at the moment, actuarial examination system does reflect to some extent some climate risk or even ESG elements into the process. So for those of you who are currently writing exams, you might come across these features. But certainly, if some of you want to go more in depth in that space in the future, you might want to consider writing a certificate. So in my slides, I've included links to the Society of Actuaries Climate Risk Certification Program. There's also the UK IFOA Institute Faculty of Actuaries that has a climate risk and sustainability course. Myself, I wrote a CFA, Chartered Financial Institute, climate risk valuation and investing certificate. So it's more on the asset side of things. And yeah, I think definitely modeling skills are very important for work in climate space. And on the I guess leadership skills, or I call them leadership skills. I don't call them soft skill, but having a definitely a curious mind, or not being afraid to take on research into that area, or projects outside of your comfort zone. That would be definitely skills that you would need to have, because this is it's still a fairly new space. I mean, there's no history much with the data, so there's a lot of work to be done. And also, I would say collaborating with other professionals working in that sphere is important: climate scientists, risk managers, systems experts. I don't know, Harry, if you have any other thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on majority of it. I think from a technical standpoint, passing the exams, continue to build your technical skills because as I mentioned, when it comes to climate related modeling, there's still, a lot of modeling required. So I think continue to build that foundation of knowledge of actuarial science. That's important. Um, on the soft skill side, I think it will be important to stay curious, to have that curiosity because climate is something that continues to evolve and there continue to be new things out there. So I think not only for the new actuaries, upcoming actuaries, but also for the actuaries that have been in the industry for a while, it's a continuous learning. So I think having that curiosity, continue to uh, you know having the capacity to learn new things, I think that's important. Thinking outside the box is another one because sometimes when you look at climate, um, looking into the past and then looking at the current, sometimes you don't see that um, the connection. So that's which means that sometimes when you're looking at how to manage those climate risks, you wanted to also have be able to think outside the box and to not just rely on the historical data, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. Well said. I think, this space is pretty new, and then having a curious mind, you're the pioneer of this space and you have to explore different stuff in this new industries. And this kind of goes to the next questions we have in the chat from Chen. Do you know if we have enough historical data for emergent climate risk for it to be credible? If not, how do we handle that?
Yeah, I mean, from the asset side of the equation, I would say that no, that's the main issue that we don't really have historical data. Um, what we have is basically forward-looking. Well, we have both backward-looking data and forward-looking data. For example, for transition risk of a portfolio, we can certainly look at the carbon intensity of a portfolio. So, how many companies in the portfolio are high in terms of being exposed to being emitters of carbon of greenhouse gas emissions themselves, or using energy that emits a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. Why it's important? Well, again, because of carbon tax evolution, eventually it may bring taxation on those companies, or those companies may become stranded assets. So portfolios will not hold those companies. Um, but more and more, we're relying on the asset side on forward-looking information. For example, companies' transition plans. So companies like any companies listed on the TSX will, most of them have a transition plan outlining how they expect to become net zero over time. And the quality and the information contained in this transition plan can guide investors on whether these assets, these companies are a good or risky buy for their portfolio. So yeah, I think limited past information and reliance on forward-looking information is what asset portfolio managers are doing.
Yeah, and on the life and health side, I think data is also um, a key discussion point because it takes much longer time when it comes to life insurance to actually having those credible data to emerge, right? Like when you have, um, for example, when you have certain, um, respiratory disease, right? Like, you know, how do you actually getting the historical data and be able to actually definitively say, okay, this is something that really due to, you know, this uh, climate change events, right? So those things are not gonna. It's gonna take a long time for it to emerge. So as a result of that, sometimes you need to take a long time to actually collect those data to say that it's credible. Also, there's I say another question: what are some of the things that are um, learning as well? I think from a data standpoint, when it comes to, let's say, excessive heat, right? Like um, it on the surface also you think about, okay, if you have a area where generally the normal temperature is 20 degrees and all of a sudden you have the excessive heat, that certainly had an adverse impact to the people's health. However, if you're looking at some areas where is historically very cold, then you have this excessive heat or having the global warming, that might actually help, right, in some of the mortality. So then that's one of the areas where maybe climate change have maybe offsetting impact depending on where you are. And this is where also life insurance company also is looking at is understanding the impact of climate to the population is one thing, but also understanding the impact to your underlying insured, right? Like knowing what are the where your insurance population, what's their exposure to those climate events is important, and that's also back to the credibility issue. Is you can have uh, a credible data on the general population, but when you start looking at company's own underlying insured population may not be credible.
Mhm. Yeah, interesting, because it's hard to make that correlations with like mortality and stuff, and how marginally would you change that pricing? It's also a question to be discussed. And following up from Chen's questions, is there any topic that you are still researching or still learning about right now, and anything that you're excited about this new space?
Oh yeah, there's plenty. I mean, what excites me? Well, I'm part of a task force from the IFOA Planetary Solid Sea Research. So IFOA established a task force. So task force role is to basically engage with policymakers, government policymakers to basically accelerate or realize that the risk to financial sectors and human beings is real with a warming climate. It's not something that is benign. So I think I would say it's the activist in me that likes to be part of a task force like that to engage with policymakers, executive financial institutions to provide propose action. And I think a space that is also growing is what we would call adaptation. So we talked so far about mitigation of climate risk, reducing greenhouse gas emission, but like I said earlier, I mean the estimates is that we're aiming towards 2.63 degrees Celsius, which is pretty high. So there will be some adaptation measures by companies or by governments, by sectors to climate change that will have to be made. So I think this is a very interesting field of study as well, or implementation.
Yeah, so whatever comes with a risk, and then also on the flip side, that's the opportunities, right?
Yeah.
And I think on another piece that, from my perspective, is I think is the affordability of insurance. I think that's one area where it's certainly something that if you look at, if you follow the news, there's certainly on at least in the U.S. side, there are certain areas where they're prone to certain climate related events. Then generally the insurance premiums are quite high in those regions, and then there's certainly a lot of pullback from the insurance companies in terms of either providing coverage or increasing the cost of the insurance, which essentially render a lot of the insurance coverage become unaffordable for the local residents. And then that's an area of areas that need to be solved. What are the solution? There might be different solutions, but again, this is an area where evolving, and also there's factors that are maybe outside of our control. There may be certain political related factors going to play into it, but those are the things where maybe not as exciting, but those are the things that are need to be keep a close eye on, and also looking for some clarity in the future.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Like sometimes it might be inevitable, no matter how much we try to prevent, and we're trying to adapt to it and finding new opportunities in here. Okay. I think we are on the dot. It's 7:02. Seeing no questions from the chat. Unless anyone else have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or have your questions on the chat. But if not, it was
Can I just make a
yeah,
little plug for an article that I thought was really interesting recently? I read last month from
of
the
course.
Canadian
Yeah.
Institute of Actuaries newsletter. It's written by two actuaries. One is a PNC actuary, and the other one is a life actuary. So Cassandra Tontini and Gloria Sari. I put the link in the chat, and they basically talk about modeling climate risk, but from a P&C perspective and from a life perspective, and how there are similarities. So I think the audience might like to read that to get a sense of modeling in those from those two perspectives.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, and I'll post that on our YouTube channel too, in the descriptions if any audience interesting to look at that. Um, Yeah, I think that's it from our side. Well, super appreciate Andrew, Harry, Sally, and Amy to help us coordinate this webinar. And thank you for the Canadian Institute actually for Empower our webinar series. It was great to meet you all, and we do have one more, we'll have two more webinar in the upcoming 2 months before our ASNA conference on January, so stay tuned on that. But overall, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you in the upcoming future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.